I have taught JavaScript to tons and tons of developers, and I've seen them make the same mistakes over and over and over again. In this video, let's talk about the 5 most common mistakes I see with JavaScript equality. All right, first off, everyone, if you're new to the channel, my name is James Q Quick, and I do weekly and 2 to 3 sometimes per week videos on web development related topics. So if you're interested, make sure to stick around and check out more on the channel. Now, I do want to let you know of one thing that will be relevant for aspiring or just existing web developers. My friend Amy Dutton and I have started a podcast called compressed.fm. You can check out the link below, or it's at compressed.fm. We will be launching in the middle of April, so by the time this is out or by the time you watch this, it may already be live on your favorite podcast provider. So go and check it out if you're interested in those topics. In the meantime, let's go ahead and dive in and check on equality in JavaScript. All right, so let's actually show these examples by writing a little bit of code. And I'm using the Quokka extension in VS Code. This will live run my code and log out the results either next to the line or below in the terminal. That way we can see our input pretty easily. I've got a video on the Quokka extension if you want to check that out. So these equality mistakes, the first thing is your basic truthy and falsy. And this is one of the trickier things in JavaScript of figuring out how things become truthy or falsy. And a lot of it is with this kind of behind the scenes, semi-magical conversion of some sort of data type or thing to a true false value. So let's look at an example here. If I create a variable called first name and call this James. So we have our variable, and a common check you'll see is if there is no first name. So if not first name, a little shorthand here. We'll talk about this in a second. We'll log out no name. Else we'll say console log hey first name. All right, so you'll see here, this is gonna trigger the else, hey James, and that's because as you might have expected, it's going to look at first name, it's gonna see that it's a string, and it also sees that it has a value inside of it. Now, if we start to tweak this, and we say this is an empty string, now this truthy falsy changes. An empty string now basically converts to false. It's a falsy value, so that it triggers this first condition. Now, a couple of other examples of this, null and undefined will also trigger a falsy value. So there's null, there's undefined. So it's going to trigger that. And the only way for a string to be truthy is if it is a valid string and there actually is something in it. Now, this is a mistake that I see people make all the time, not understanding basic truthy falsy. That's specifically for strings. We'll see a few more examples of truthy falsy in the next ones that we do. Highly recommend it if you're new to JavaScript and the idea of truthy falsy is new to you. The best way to learn about it is like you can go look at like a reference for like what is truthy and falsy. The best way to me to do it is just start logging stuff out like this to kind of see what does what. Anyway, basic truthy and falsy here with a string. And we'll move on to number 2. This is a favorite of mine because it's something that's so overlooked in a lot of languages, and it's the idea of objects or equality for objects versus primitives and how they differ. So if you look in here, we've got 2 different person objects, right? We've got person 1 and person 2. They both have the same properties. And so I wonder what you would expect if we did person 1, and then we did double equals, for example, and then person 2. Take a second, pause the video if you need to, and think about what the answer to this is. The fact that I'm leading up to it is probably a tell that it may not be what you expect. But person 1 equals person 2, the answer is no. And the reason is that objects are, let's say the person and person 2 variables, those are actually pointers to the actual objects in memory. So what I'm saying is that person 1 is its own object over here, its own space in memory that has those properties inside of it. Person 2 is also an object that points to a space in memory over here that also happens to have those same properties. But when we check equality between objects, we're not looking at the data inside of them. We're looking at those actual pointers, those actual spaces in memory. So in that sense, these things are not equal. Now, if I did a person 3 and assign this to person 1, and let's copy and paste this one. Let's say does person 1 equal person 3? This is going to be true because now they are both pointing to the same space in memory, which means they have the same details. Now, the other part of this, that's with objects. If we're looking at primitives are strings and numbers, that sort of stuff. If we look at person1.name equals person1.name, or excuse me, person2, I did this all wrong, person2.name, that will be true because those are primitive values. They're actually comparing the values, which is the string of name. And then if we also similarly compared the age variable, this will be true as well. Again, numbers and strings are primitives. When you compare them, it's comparing the value directly. When you compare objects, though, when you check for equality between objects, it's looking at the actual space in memory and comparing that. So even if they have the same data, they may not be equal in JavaScript. All right, so let's move down to number 3. And this is maybe a few bold statements here. Numbers and strings can be equal, and you can also add them. Super weird. So let's take a look at this. Let's say we have our age is 30, and then we have age string is 30. Don't really know why you would have this right offhand, but let's say you have a number that has a number value and then a string that has that number value but inside of a string. If we now check console log age double equals age string, this is going to be true because double equals now does not take into account the type of data. It does a conversion on each side to see if those things equal each other. So it doesn't take into a fact that it's a string versus number. It just looks at the value and says, hey, these values look like they're the same. And basically what it does is it takes the age and converts it to a string. It's going to do that, and then it's going to say, hey, these things both have the value of like 30 of the string 30. So in that case, those things are true. Now, the other aspect of this is if we do a triple equals. This introduces types of the data into the equation, which means age is a number, string or age string is a string. It's going to take that into account and say, hey, these are not the same data type. Those things are not equal at all. So a couple of really key things as we go through these. Truthy versus falsy is huge. And then also the idea of double equals versus triple equals, where double equals takes into account, I lied. Triple equals takes into account the data type, where the double equals does not. Now, the other interesting thing about this is we can take our age and we can, which is a number, add it to a string, and something kind of weird happens that you may not expect. So let's do age string here. And you see that this creates the string 3030 odd. So what it does is it says, hey, these are two different data types. They can't like really be added together. So it's going to take age, similarly to how it converted it up here with the double equals to a string. It's going to convert that to a string. And then basically what we're looking at is this. We're having two strings, 30 plus 30. I feel like this should be an ESPN commercial, 30 for 30. Anybody watch that? Anyway, so 30 plus 30 gives us that total string, concatenated string of 3030. So numbers and strings can be equal, and you can add them. All right, let's move on down to number 4. Now, this one comes from something really interesting for me. I use a lot of environment variables. So you store like secret credentials or variables that change based on which environment you're running in. And you store them in environment files or inside of your host in Netlify. I've got a video on environment variables that you can check out in Node. And the important thing to note is that all values that come from environment variables are strings, which means you end up getting something like this. You end up getting, if I want to know if I'm in dev mode and I put the environment variable to be false, it actually gives me the string of false. Now, I've made this mistake many times in my past, so you'll need to check out for this too. But a lot of times I'll check, hey, if we're not in dev mode, then I will say not dev, and then else I will say dev, right? Seems pretty straightforward. But notice that this thing is logging out dev and not dev. Well, that's because if you go back to our truthy falsy, this thing is a string that has the value of false inside of it, but a string is truthy if it's a valid string and it has anything inside of it. So this thing is actually a truthy value, which means it's triggering this part down here. So to check this appropriately, you need to check, hey, does dev mode equal or triple equal? Triple equal maybe to be safe. Does it equal false? If that's the case, we're comparing the string value of false, not the Boolean value, but we're comparing the string value here. And if that's the case, it's going to log out not dev, which it does. Now, again, I've made this mistake and I've sat here wondering why my environment variables weren't working, because they're always strings, and then you have to check them appropriately, even if you're treating them or thinking they should be treated like Booleans. All right, let's go down to our last one, number 5. This is a fun one for me. Let's look at const array equals empty Empty array. A lot of times we'll do this check. Actually, let's start with something like null, right? So we talked about this check before. If not array, the very common thing, truthy, falsy values. We'll say no array, else we'll say we got one. Yay. All right. So we talked about this before. If the array is null, then this not array now is going to equate to true because that thing is basically looked at as a falsy value. If this was undefined, this would be the same thing, right? So no array there. The thing that you may or may not expect is an empty array now, if we type it correctly. An empty array is a truthy value. This means that it is not considered to be undefined or null. Well, it's literally not undefined or null, but it converts to a truthy value because it is a valid actual array. Now, the same thing goes for an object. Forget the fact that I'm not renaming this variable, but if I have an empty object in here, even if it doesn't have properties inside of it, notice that we still get the we got one message. Now, let's go back to arrays in here. All right, so what you might want to do is you might want to check, hey, if there is no array, say no array, else if we can change this condition to say, hey, array.length equals 0. Then say we got an empty one. And then we can say we got one. This way we're checking all different conditions. Is it undefined or null, right? That's one check. Then is it a valid array, but it's empty? That's another check. And then is it an actual array and we have data inside of it? So you might have 3 different conditions when you're checking here, something to do with arrays and the data inside them, or if there's data or not. All right, so those are the top 5 most common mistakes I see made in JavaScript equality. I'm thinking I might make a series of videos on JavaScript mistakes. So if you're interested in other categories, maybe with arrays or objects or whatever else, let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see more common mistakes in JavaScript. Let me know. Thanks as always for checking out the video, and I'll catch you next time.